Thank you, Merrick. I'd like to invite our first panel onto the stage at this point, and I do invite you to follow along. We're using Slido today, so you can either use it directly online or download the app. The code is M899. You can heckle our speakers, you can ask them questions, you can vote on the best questions, all via Slido, so please do get engaged in the conversation. The first panel this morning will focus on innovation. We heard obviously a lot about innovation as we went across the country. We heard a lot about fundamental and applied science, how universities are successfully working with businesses to drive innovation and develop new patents, processes, and products. So we really look forward to the discussion. We do have full bios in the program, so we won't spend a lot of time introducing folks this morning. And I will pass things over to Paul Wells, who will moderate this session. Paul?
Thanks very much. This works. It's good. The technology works. That's usually a good sign. I'll be sitting here with the panelists. I feel more comfortable that way. We're going to have two panel discussions this morning, one on innovation and one on talent, a handy sort of typology that I've been advocating in my columns on these issues over the last several months. It's been a weird week in Ottawa for a bunch of reasons. But maybe the most germane is that we've made it all the way to Thursday without having an innovation panel. If having innovation panels was what drove innovation, Canada would already be more advanced than Wakanda. But the good thing about this one is that the discussions are going to be shorter. And so I'm going to encourage our panelists to save all the stuff they normally say at such conferences for the 20 minutes that they won't have at the end, and use the time that we do have to innovate in their remarks. Coming up on this stage is Rob Annan, who's Vice President of Genome Canada and a Public Policy Forum Fellow and a veteran of these events. We have Suzanne Fortier, who's the Principal and Vice Chancellor of McGill University, and Santa Ono, who's the President and Vice Chancellor of the University of British Columbia. We're just going to have them fight. And Pooja Viswanathan, who's the CEO of Braze Mobility, who actually works in the private sector. We're going to have a good discussion, partly because I'm not going to take part in most of it. But I do want to ask our two university presidents, perhaps Dr. Fortier, you could begin. The composition of this panel assumes that there's something interesting and useful happening at the intersection of university and private enterprise. Obviously, government attention has focused on that interface between the academy and the private sector. What's useful left to do at that interface between universities and the private sector?
Oh, so much is left to do. We need to do more of it, if I could put it this way. We do a lot of great things in Canada, and one of the issues is we don't do them at the right scale. Scale up, double down, whatever expression you want. That's what I think we need to do here.
Okay. Dr. Ono. And feel free, since we do have 40 minutes, feel free to expand on your thoughts. But
okay.
I would say that the recent competition for research superclusters is just a clear example of how fruitful and useful it is to catalyze that kind of conversation between industry, academia, and organizations that support research, fundamental research, and the translation of research. I can say that in Vancouver, that competition really brought together individuals that rarely got together, and that has persisted. And regardless of the outcome of that competition, will have a lasting positive effect on what we do in Vancouver and British Columbia. So that is something that I think we need to, as Canadians, hardwire into how we go about thinking about shaping the innovation ecosystem.
So I've heard it asserted that, almost as you said, Dr. Ono, regardless of the outcome of the supercluster competition, a lot of these superclusters that self-identified and organized are going to remain active after the competition's over.
Absolutely, and I think it's exciting that people are getting together Groups are moving forward with plans, regardless of the outcome of that competition. Certainly, success will not be something that will not be celebrated, but in any case, it's something that we have to do one way or another. And there's so much merit in all of the applications, especially those that have been shortlisted, that I think it's important for local government as well as federal government to figure out a way to come together to fund those efforts.
Okay. Pooja, Viswanathan, working as you do now, obviously your academic background is formidable, but now working out in the private sector, are you as persuaded as you might once have been that the source and the driver of Canadian innovation is in universities?
It's really interesting. I think for me, some of the most pivotal points in my own career as an academic and what led me to start the company was actually a CIHR grant that had an industry partner as a collaborator. It was only an in-kind partnership, but it did wonders in terms of getting me to be more aware about market pull versus technology push, which I think is a huge problem right now in terms of research, especially in the physical technologies space. Okay. The second thing that happened was a CIHR knowledge translation grant that I had won, where I pulled together a lot of people from the private sector and different kinds of researchers from multiple disciplines. That was, again, a huge point at which I think that was actually the point when I decided to become an entrepreneur. Okay. Academic research has been fundamental to what I do. It's been the reason I've been able to bring a product out to market in such a complex healthcare space. However, that collaboration is so key, and I think that's what we're missing. So I think we have a lot of great research happening, and I think it is definitely key to moving innovation forward, but that can't happen if we continue to work in silos. So we really do need that collaboration piece happening.
Okay, could you tell us a bit about Braze Mobility for those who still need an elevator pitch?
Yeah, absolutely. So Braze Mobility, we build aftermarket sensors that can essentially add on to any wheelchair and transform it into a smart wheelchair. And this is to improve safety and independence of people with mobility impairment. So you can think about it as backup sensor technologies and all of that for cars, but for wheelchairs instead. It's been the whole wheelchair technology space has really been lacking in terms of innovation. And so we've brought a lot of those innovations from the automotive industry into the wheelchair space, but that could not have been possible without a lot of multi-stakeholder involvement and a lot of the academic research that went into it. But more importantly, the stakeholder engagement that actually came after I started the company.
Okay, you build your stuff in Canada?
Yes.
Is it substantially export-oriented, or?
Our customers are in Canada and the US. The US is definitely a bigger customer than Canada.
Okay. Rob, Annan, you've been following all of this for a little while, and it's interesting that Dr. Ono mentioned the Supercluster initiative. The big policy question, I guess, in the last year in Canada has been the extent to which government should be doing things like superclusters, or the extent to which it should be doing things like Naylor. Without asking you to vote in that dispute, I wonder whether you could sort of map the terrain of that tension.
Yeah, sure. And I assume that there's no one from the government here, so I can speak freely about that.
They're everywhere.
So I think the big problem we've had in this country for a long time is this sense of either or, right? That you're going to be either innovation focused or you're going to be basic research focused. In reality, like in the actual labs, those two things don't exist independently. So there is a continuum within research, within a single researcher's sort of their own research program. There will be back and forth. So first of all, either or, kind of we should do away with that. Having said that, you have to make policy decisions, and so the government is going to have to make decisions about where to place investments in order to sort of generate the outcomes they want. The way I see this, the way I understand this, is that there are certain fundamental things we understand about how innovation, economic growth happen. We know we need talent. We know we need research capacity and skill. We know we need technological capabilities. So there's a certain foundation that I think we can pretty comfortably create policy around. And that foundation includes funding for fundamental science and basic research. That is the foundation of our training. That is the day-to-day, sort of gasoline that drives the research enterprise in the country. So we know we need that. We know we need good, sort of industrial policy to encourage, companies to grow in Canada and so on and so forth. We need talent policy for both recruitment and retention. So there's a foundation that we know we need. And then on top of that, frankly, we don't really know what's going to work. That's why these panels happen weekly, as you say, right? We're sort of casting about, trying to figure out how do you actually create innovation? How do you create an ecosystem that is innovative, that has growth, and so on? And I think, to be honest, no one says this explicitly, but we're kind of just muddling about. We create policies, the Supercluster initiative. I think it's a great idea. Will it work? I hope so. It might not. And if it doesn't, we'll try something else. And I think we have to keep that sort of mentality that we have to innovate around innovation in a sense, both on the policy side as well as on organizations that, that we create through programs like the NCEs and so on, that they themselves are going to maybe have a big impact and maybe they won't. But we need to keep trying these policy things in order to build the right sorts of connections that will foster growth of companies and so on.
Dr. Ona, you wanted to follow up?
I think that Merrick's comment about Naylor meets Barton is really at the crux of what we need to do as a nation. I think that too many people have read one or the other. They need to be required reading together. And I think that the dialogue really needs to focus on the nexus between the two. There's some reference to the importance of translational research and fundamental science being the seed corn for innovation in the Naylor report, and vice versa. The Barton report really does refer to the importance of fundamental science. But I think that what really needs to happen is an intensive discussion and analysis of the interface. I think that nations and entities that really think about that handoff and come up with programs and policies and incentives to really make that happen smoothly and robustly are the ones that will get it right. And so I think that should be where the conversation should ultimately lead.
Dr. Fortier?
I just want to say that I think Santa is spot on. I was really impressed with Merrick's speech this morning. We have the right elements. I think that's essentially what he says. If we think of it as an ecosystem, we've got all the right parts. Some are not at the right scale, and we're sluggish in the connecting among the various parts. We intentionally sometimes put some speed bumps that are not necessary. We're not agile enough. It takes too long to get people to realize the objectives that they have in mind, because there's so many little hurdles here and there and long delays and competitive. Great to have competition, but if at the end it means that you lose your agility, we should think of different ways of working in that space. And so I think Santa and Merrick earlier were talking about the ecosystem are really spot on. We've got the right things, and let's decrease some of these speed bumps and create that ability to be far more agile than we are now. We are often have the great ideas, but we are, and you mentioned that yourself, we're late in putting them in place. And so we lose out to many other countries that have learned to be much more agile in their path to innovation.
Okay.
I think my colleague, I think what you said was right. You talked about, you asked that sort of provocative question about, is fundamental science important? And you said, yes, the CRHR grant was pivotal. And I think what you said, where you talked about some programs that facilitated that discussion, even though it was an in-kind contribution. And I think really taking a look from a government perspective, a policy perspective of how to really reinforce those things that were pivotal to your success is where we should really be focusing.
Okay, a couple housekeeping questions. First of all, we're starting to get questions, as you can see on Slido.
Yes.
Feel free. I'm going to throw one of them to this panel in a minute. Those of you who haven't put questions on Slido, now you see that it's possible, and I encourage you to join the conversation. I do want to ask about this question of agility, because my other housekeeping note is that I was given prepared questions that the PPF would like me to ask, and they're good questions. And one of them is exactly how can the university enterprise ecosystem increase its agility to respond more quickly to these kinds of challenges?
Yeah, I mean, I think I sort of touched upon them. It would be the same thing. So more collaboration with industry, and even if it's something as simple as an in-kind contribution. I mean, some of the insights that came from talking to our industry partners in just a few meetings was still so impactful for me in my career, because I had never thought about those things as an academic, a researcher kind of working in our bubble in our lab. So that piece, there definitely needs to be a bit more training with academics, even for academics who don't want to become an entrepreneur, entrepreneurial skills are so important in terms of understanding how the market works. Even if you are doing fundamental science, it's so important to understand how that research might be applied in the real world. And that is very much lacking. So even in my own academic groups, by the way, I run a company, but I still haven't completely given up my academic hat. So I still continue now to be sort of a commercialization fellow. Postdoc is kind of a weird sort of self-created title almost. But I still continue to engage highly with researchers. We're just asking very different questions now. And a lot of them have, those questions have come up because of my work in the private sector in bringing a product out into the real world. So it's not that I've moved away from research. I've come back with far more insight, actually. So I think a lot of that training has really been key. And I think there is this tendency with working in bubbles, working in silos, that you don't often understand what the impact of that research can be in the real world. So I think that needs to come right from day one in the research program, is understanding how whatever it is that you're creating, whether it's technology or policy or process, how that might be used in the real world is really important to know.
Okay. One thing that's, I'll let you go, sure, go ahead.
I'd say that one of the most exciting things that I've heard on the past couple of days here in Ottawa is that in speaking to ministers and parliamentary secretaries and individuals like that people are understanding that the real ROI can come from policy decisions on fields intersecting. And agility really depends upon supporting groups of scientists and entrepreneurs getting together around areas that are just in their infancy. It's not just about risk, it's about policy decisions that support that kind of activity. I think that the potential benefit of a science advisor is really taking a look at how research and translational research is funded, and thinking about ways to support those early stage risky ideas and theories and hypotheses, and giving them enough runway to see whether or not they take off. And the exciting thing that I've heard in many of these offices is that people realize that that's really a key to future innovation and positioning Canada to be globally competitive.
Rob, one of the things that I am constantly struck by is the extent to which the really fast-moving, innovative businesses in this country sometimes appear almost in the absence of a policy decision. Research in Motion 20 years ago, Shopify 10 years ago, seemed to indicate that there's nothing more powerful than a good business idea. And that to some extent, policy and universities often scramble to catch up to an entrepreneur. Am I making any sense at all?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that, and I think so. There's a couple points to that. I think that you're right that there are going to be these unicorns or whatever, shooting stars or whatever that happen for whatever reason, circumstance, and so on. And you can't. You can create conditions to maybe encourage that, but there's nothing you can do about that. That's a confluence of random events or what have you. It's how do you build a system that just sort of that motors along like the broad base that actually is doing well and growing and being innovative and so on. So I think we're not trying to create the next, we all hope that Shopify becomes the next, well, maybe not BlackBerry, but the next sort of ongoing success. But and we want to make policies that encourage that. But there's only so much you can do. But what does drive even those situations, I think, is still talent, right? That we have to make sure that we have in Canada people, and not just scientists and tech nerds and so on, but really smart business people, really smart policy people, really smart leaders. So talent is a key element, no matter what. And so we need to make sure that we're creating an ecosystem of the universities, for instance, that do that. The last thing I'll say, and this kind of leads back to the last point too, is that universities are big, complex institutions. So the idea of like, how do we get more university industry collaboration happening makes it sound like there's like two entities, two people that talk. There are potential touch points, hundreds, thousands of them. And so again, it comes down to individual people and individual talent and lots of different potential mechanisms, right? So we have things like, Val Walker's speaking after, a Business Higher Education Roundtable, CEOs and presidents talking strategically about what we can do. But then you've got programs like at MyTax or other programs that are like students actually going and visiting and spending time in both places, like on the ground, strategically, lots of touch points. So being able to innovate different ways to bring them together and having multiple touch points, I think is a really key element.
Okay. Dr. Fortier, 3 of the questions that have come in through Slido are essentially questions about the ivory tower or the notion of an ivory tower. One is whether the Supercluster initiative is essentially an elite-driven initiative. It brings together the kind of people who know the kind of people who run superclusters. And is there any way to break down that perception of elitism? A second is whether there are ways to ensure and reinforce the role of women in innovative business. And the third is simply, how do you explain all of this to ordinary people who are increasingly skeptical of these big initiatives?
Yeah, let me talk about the supercluster, and I'll tell you my vision of where I hope they will evolve to. As you know, this was one of the topics that we discussed a lot in the Barton group. And our vision, we use different words. We talked about the innovation marketplace. And I like very much that particular vision. I hope Supercluster will be that. A much more open environment, like a market. If I've got something to sell, I can go there. It's open to everybody who has something interesting to bring to the market. And if I'm a customer, I can go there. It's not a club, it's completely open, and it's open to all these young entrepreneurs. There's a lot of women entrepreneurs who are trying to get those connections. I think often we go through these processes that are so competition-oriented that we sometimes diminish the openness of what we need to do in terms of creating environment. Open environment. So that would be my vision of those supercluster evolving to be just that. We've had those initiatives in the past where it was a competition, you win the competition, you're in the club. And those who were not there at the beginning are not in the club. I think we've got to move out of that kind of mode and say, this is a great initiative. It's an area in which Canada should invest. There's a lot of potential, but let's make it completely open so that anybody at any time can come in if they have a contribution to make there, either as a customer, as a seller, as a connector, whatever they have to bring to that supercluster or innovation marketplace. It's open to them.
Okay. Santa Ono, you're just itching to get in.
Be really quick.
Absolutely. But then I've got another question for you. But
yeah,
sure.
I'd say really it's the responsibility of the successful superclusters. You know, if you look at the digital technology supercluster, obviously there's some very, very large multinational companies involved. But there's another layer of companies that we've intentionally included. And so I think it's really the responsibility of those that are overseeing the allocation of resources once they're made to ensure that it really is open, as Suzanne said. And if they don't, then it'll really be a mistake. Because certainly in Vancouver, much of the secret sauce of that success in that metropolitan area and its contribution to Canada are really the new startup companies that eventually grow and scale up, and we hope they stay in Canada. Those superclusters must support that kind of activity as well.
Okay, there is a question for you from the board here.
Yeah.
Basically, it says you've been in the States, you've been in Canada.
I'm glad to be in Canada, by the way.
Yeah, although less so in January. How do the two countries operate similarly and differently on the ground at this point of interface between universities and innovative business?
You know, I'd say there are many aspects where I'd say Canada is significantly in the lead. I think this sort of research supercluster conversation, to many of my colleagues in the United States, they're envious of it, that a nation can come together and really think critically about how they do things. It's a little bit chaotic down there right now, as you can imagine, and as you know from watching news every morning. So I think that they are very, very impressed with this moment in Canada, the fact that we're coming together and thinking about what we're going to do moving forward in terms of the innovation economy. It's a really focused effort. And I think we just have to wait and see how we seize the moment as a nation, and I believe we're going to do it right.
Okay. There was a question about the chief science advisor. Does she play in this kind of terrain that we're describing? Rob.
Well, my understanding is that her mandate doesn't really extend this far. So directly, no. But I say more generally, whether it's the federal chief science advisor or now the two science advisors in Ontario and Quebec can still play, I think, an important kind of leadership role in terms of promoting the value of science in society, but also as being an ambassador for the science enterprise writ large. And the universities are, of course, the big engine of this, but there's still really important and interesting science happening in government, the NRC, and there's college work going on. So there is a broad community, and so I think they can play a leadership role and help, in a sense, kind of open up and make that space a little more transparent. But directly, my understanding is that the mandate doesn't actually involve sort of this space.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to?
Yeah, I mean, it's very early for us with the chief scientific advisor, but there have been many countries that have had these positions before. My sense of what they're doing is principally looking at evidence-based policy making and helping governments do that. But also, I saw a question flashing here. It is in, I don't know if we use the word restoring or maintaining the trust between people and the scientific enterprise. Many people are doubting, and they look at the web and they say, well, what I read on the web doesn't correspond to what this expert or this great scientist is saying, and so on. There is a problem of trust between the general population and increasingly and science, and we need to restore it. I think that's a very important role for a public scientific advisor, and I know in many countries, in UK, US, and so on, it is one of their roles, certainly.
Okay. So a chief science advisor could function kind of the way that a surgeon general does in the United States, as an advocate for public health or for research. There's one of the questions I was given is helpfully disillusioning. Amid all of this talk about Business University R&D collaboration, and the Barton panel pointed this out, there's actually been a decline in business and university R&D collaboration in recent years. I'll start with you, Pooja. Why do you suppose that amid all this talk, there's actually, if not less collaboration as such, that Canada is being outstripped by other countries on this axis of collaboration between the two sectors?
I don't think I can speak to the decline in general, but as someone who's been on both sides, so before as an academic and now as often an industry partner trying to work with my prior colleagues, I can definitely say that there have been some disincentives for me personally, often working with my own colleagues in that capacity. There's a lot of frustration in terms of, for example, not necessarily understanding value of intellectual property. So that's something that I've needed to educate a lot of my colleagues about, is how intellectual property works and what protection entails and what's protectable and what's not, and respecting inventorship and things like that, which is often not necessarily respected depending on the research group. And so that's been a frustration. The other frustrations are around not understanding market pull or validation. So if I'm trying to understand, and it's funny because I was on the other side a few years ago, where I was a researcher trying to talk to an industry partner, asking them why they wouldn't license our technology, and they started asking me about well, how many people in the market need this product? How many people will pay for this product? And I didn't have those answers. My solution was to go out and get those answers. But now I'm in the spot where I'm asking the researchers the same questions, and they don't want to do that work. They don't want to go out and bring that, bring me back that information, because they think it's outside of what their role is as professors and researchers. So that's a frustration that I currently face. But because I've been on both sides, I make a very active effort in trying to educate, or I'm not an enemy in this case, right? I come at it as an ally, but I can see why I can actually empathize now with a lot of industry partners who are turned off by some of these collaborations. Another missing piece is often there isn't enough knowledge that's actually brought back into the industry partners. So in these cases where there's in-kind or industry academic partnerships, in fact, even within multiple disciplines where you have a lot of grants that are now expecting, knowledge users and all of that, there's very little collaboration that actually happens after the grant gets accepted. So after the money comes in, there's little to no collaboration that actually happens between all these fantastic researchers and partners on the grant. A lot because of communication barriers, so just not being able to speak the same language, which often frustrates people, and they say, you know what, they're just going to do their thing and I'm just going to do my thing. And so there isn't really enough working together, and as an industry partner, you're putting in all these in-kind or cash contributions. You want to know what value you're getting out of it, and if there isn't that reporting back, it's very frustrating to an industry partner.
So a lot of these co-sponsor arrangements are essentially Potemkin villages that don't really, that don't go out and operate in the real world after they've gotten the approval. Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Everybody wants a piece of this question. Dr. Otto?
I would say,
I want to have a say on this one.
go back to the Nexus issue. I think an opportunity, and what I'm hearing in my conversations in Ottawa is we're looking at how we resource that connectivity between academia and industry. And so one of the things that can be learned for what's happening in the States is there's been proportionally more money and larger amounts of money where there is a benefit both to the company and to academia, so that it's not just at the grant stage, but throughout the whole life of the project, there's a clear reward to both the company and to academia. So that kind of resourcing is one of the things that I think the federal government can do. The chief science advisor can catalyze that kind of conversation about how to incent that and cement the nexus. So that's one thing that can be done. I think part of it also has to do with the resourcing of that kind of activity in the States. A lot of that comes from the indirect cost rate. So if you look at a typical American research university, there are a lot of people that are the link between the innovator, the scientist, the fundamental scientists that ideally should really be focused on innovating in science. But there are lots of people that are sort of shuttle diplomats between the scientist and the industrial researcher or the industrial representative, just generally speaking. And that money just doesn't exist in the Canadian institutions. So that's not an excuse. But it's just to put a finger on one reason why there's less of that, and there's less patenting activity in Canada. That if you don't have the resource to support the writing of patents, you don't have the resource to really connect industry to fundamental science, naturally you would expect that there would be less of that activity. Even with that being the case, I think that universities receiving significant federal support for fundamental science have a responsibility to do the best they can to reach out. And I think in the local roundtable that we held in Vancouver, part of the frustration from the corporate scientists was that they were tired of going to the university. And there needs to be more of the universities, and universities are doing that, but we need to do even more of that, going out into the community, convening individuals, and saying, we want to work with you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Fortier.
Yes, that was a bit frustrating on the Barton panel. I had some great discussion with my colleagues there, because if you look at many of the numbers, in fact, if you use as your proxy for the health of these relationships the amount of money that industry invests out of their R&D dollars in university, Canada does very, very well. We're one of the top countries. So you look at this and say, wait a minute, why don't we use that as the sign, as our measure? What was used to show that it was a decrease is a survey done, it's work done by the World Economic Forum. And that is a response to the question posed to CEOs of companies. What do you think is the state of university industry partnership? And even though it may not reflect actually the state in terms of the numbers, it reflects a problem. A problem is in the culture. If the perception of our CEOs is that we're not doing very well, we've got a problem. No matter what the other sets of numbers might show, we've got a problem. And I think it speaks to what actually Santa was talking about. Marta Craig will sometimes talk about the fact that we need more hockey scouting type of activities in our university. It is very difficult to make those relationships grow and to nurture them. We're good at creating them, but then, we show up once every 6 months, once every year to nurture the relationship. It doesn't help us create those strong, long-lasting relationship because we don't have the resources, and we don't have the resources to do it. I think it's a real problem, and so that creates that perception. That's exactly what the question. If you look at the reference, it was the perception of CEO as to how we were doing, and you spoke very well about this. Why do you have this perception? Because of all these little hurdles, which may not all be solved, but certainly would be helped by if we had the kind of resources that Santa was talking about. We don't have those people.
Okay. We're now in the world of moderator's nightmare because I've got 3 minutes, which is barely enough time to start a new subject without going crashing through our time barrier. Let's ask about the Naylor report because people like to ask about the Naylor report. Let's say that Bill Morneau is still a finance minister in 5 weeks and he gets up and he delivers a budget which substantially delivers on the Naylor panel commissions. Is your work here done? Is Canada's research infrastructure then perfect? Rob?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly the question. So first of all, I think there's no doubt, I think that the report lays out a compelling argument for why we need a significant investment in fundamental research. There's no doubt the granting councils are a great vehicle to deliver that kind of funding, right, that's done. But is really honestly the first step. I think that we need to have a very serious conversation in this country about a broad science strategy. Now, I'm not necessarily a big S strategy, but we need to start thinking about how are we going to actually bring the various pieces together. I've been talking about maybe getting a panel of panels together with Jenkins and Naylor, and we have sort of NRC stuff happening now. This chief science advisor is looking at internal government science. So at some point, those pieces have to be brought together, and we need to think broadly about what are our objectives as a country, what are realistic, how are we best positioned to get to those places, and then build, I think, a more integrated approach to science. So this is, I think, a bit of a crucial element, this fundamental science that we need to take care of today. But more broadly, let's talk about the ecosystem and how we're actually going to keep sort of a sustainable approach to science in the future.
Okay. As briskly, does anyone else want to address the thing?
Yeah.
I would just say focus on the Nexus and involve the companies, involve the startups in that whole conversation.
Okay. It sounds like what's needed is more meaningful interaction rather than lining up signatures on a grant application.
Yeah.
That's maybe the distinction that's usefully drawn. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
I'm going to be the first moderator in history to bring in his panel a little ahead of schedule. I want to thank our panelists for this very useful discussion. And Rob Annan, Suzanne Fortier, Sana Ono, and Pooja Viswanathan. I'll be back in several minutes for another discussion, and in the meantime, we're going to have more fun. Thanks.
Okay.
Can we get together sometime?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.